writers and readers, I'm Christy Stratus, and today is part 2 of our revision series. So we're talking about characters today, and I love revising characters. It is my favorite thing. I'm not being sarcastic, I really do love it. It's my favorite part of editing my own manuscripts. So let's get right into it. How do you edit a character? Well, the first thing to do is, I did talk about this in yesterday's video, which was about the revision basics and style and things like that. I did mention that you need to go through, and when you edit, it would be a great idea if you just read one character at a time, just sort of picking out one character's parts, reading their dialogue, reading their interaction with other characters. That can be very helpful. So for me, that's essential actually, because I've found many times that a lot of characters lose their consistency. And it's just because as you pants, like I'm a big pantser, I only outlined once recently. That was my first time outlining fiction. When you pants, you end up many times changing the character or changing the plot or whatever along the way. So it's really important to go back and make sure that you have an actually consistent character. So there are a few things you need to check for. You need to make sure that the personality stays the same, that the mannerisms match the personality throughout, that the dialogue sounds the same, and that it matches the personality and goes with the mannerisms. Everything has to mesh. So you just want to make sure that at no point does your very butch male character who's very rough and tough suddenly turn a bit too feminine when trying to comfort a female character, for example. That kind of thing can happen easily, especially when your goal is to show either a softer side to that character, the male character, or you're just trying to push ahead the female character being upset. Something along those lines. So you have to be careful that when you're writing, you're not just pushing your own agenda. Yes, you push your own agenda, but you make sure that it's consistent with your characters. If your characters break character, then they're not going to seem consistent and real, and the reader is going to feel like they don't understand that character, that they don't make sense, that they're not realistic. And of course, a big part of that is, does the psychology add up? If you've got a character who's ripping their hair out with anxiety and upset at one moment, and then the next moment is like, I'm gonna make a cup of tea, you might have a problem, you know? Like, this might be a schizophrenic character. So really rip that stuff apart, because it's important. You are going to get dinged big time in the reviews if you have characters that are just all over the place and people don't really get them. So let's break that down a bit. Now that we've talked about consistency, let's talk about dialogue. Does your character's dialogue match their personality? If you've got someone who's very aggressive but they speak in a very shy way, then the psychology has to add up for that. If it doesn't, then you're in trouble. But the dialogue should be, it can be difficult when you have two characters talking to really make sure that they sound like themselves. Each of them sounds like themselves. This is something that I think is one of the most difficult things to do, to have very, very different characters that even when they speak or even in narration, it comes across as obviously that character. For some people that's going to be pretty easy, and for some people that is a struggle. So it's important to really understand your character's personality. Like I said, if you have an aggressive character, maybe they should be using aggressive words in their dialogue. Maybe they should be using aggressive ways of talking to another person, you know, even in the way that their voice comes out, very harsh. There are a lot of things that can add up to having a consistent character, even just in terms of dialogue, even if it's in terms of how often do they speak. If you have a character that rarely speaks because they're very, very shy, and then suddenly they go on this monologue out of nowhere and it makes no sense, and you know, in terms of consistency with the character, you have to edit that out, or you have to edit it down. There has to be a reason, and if you can't find the reason, if your reason, honestly, remember, be brutally honest with yourself. If your reason is, but I need it to go in this direction, there are always ways to make it go in that direction, to get it to flow properly in that direction, and keep your characters consistent. So that's extraordinarily important. It's also, of course, important to make sure the dialogue sounds natural and not like, again, not like you as the author is trying to push them in one direction or another. They have to sort of do it on their own. I'm not saying your character can literally reach through you and be like, here we go, we're gonna make this happen the right way. But you do tend to feel your character. And if your character is just not working, it's saying no, like I would never say that, then you have to listen to them and you have to go in a different direction. There is always a way to achieve what you're trying to achieve, but keeping consistency. And what goes with the dialogue is, like I started to mention a little bit before, the mannerisms. If you have an aggressive character, then their mannerisms should also be aggressive. If you have a very gentle character, then their mannerisms should also be gentle. So I'm not saying that you have to put in a lot of stuff like she reached out and touched his hand, or, she frowned or something like that. But I am saying that where you put that in and where it fits, and only where it fits, there's nothing that drives me more crazy than unnecessary just, reaching out and touching people or sneezing or whatever. Drives me nuts when you're trying to humanize a character. It does have to be natural. It has to fit the scene and it has to fit the character. But when you have a gentle character, if you are going to put in some sort of movement, if you're going to have their psychology shown through their movements, which I do a lot in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart and in Lock and Key, then it has to match the character, it has to match the mood, all of that has to be consistent. So if you're finding that things don't match, then figure out your character first, settle on a personality, make sure then that the dialogue follows through, and then that the mannerisms also make sense. That's the order that I would do it in. I think it makes the most sense. Personality, the way they speak, their mannerisms that go along with the way they speak and their personality. And something that follows through is their interactions. Now that I also think comes last. You have to figure that character out and have them be consistent before you can have their interactions with other characters be consistent. Because you might have a character that's very gentle with one person, but with another, maybe they're very withdrawn, and maybe they're even a little bit aggressive, and it's that they sense that another character is a really bad person, but they're a little bit more talkative over here because they sense that that person is more gentle just like them, or they're trustworthy, something like that. So you can see where once your character's personalities are really set, then you can have solid consistency regardless of who they're talking to or what they're saying. You will have solid consistency throughout. But again, going back to interaction, there's of course a balance between acting like themselves and acting like themselves with another character and changing the way they act that still matches themselves, but maybe they act differently with a different character. And that's extremely important to keep that relationship consistent. And of course, as the relationship changes, the dialogue, the way they speak to each other might change, but it has to grow and you have to see that crescendo. If all of a sudden these people are acting like super close and it makes no sense, then that's definitely going to be a problem. It's going to be too fast, and your readership is going to say, wait a minute, I don't understand. I thought they didn't like each other and now they're just like acting really close and buddy-buddy. This doesn't make any sense. So as you can see, there's a lot to look at and there's a lot to work on. For me, that's exciting. I love it. For some of you, it might be overwhelming, which is why I say break it down. First the personality, then the dialogue, then the mannerisms, and follow through with interaction, and you really can't miss. And the final thing I'm going to talk about with characters is, are they interesting? Because that covers a very wide spectrum of things to think about. The reason I'm talking about are characters interesting, it's very subjective, it's a difficult topic, is because a fellow author, Michael J. Elliott, who is a horror author, said something about this being one of his main concerns when he writes. He had commented on one of my videos. That is a very valid concern. Of course it is. And I have definitely looked at my characters when writing and saying, but will anyone else find this interesting? And like I said, it's very subjective. It's kind of a difficult thing to evaluate, which is again another important reason to have other people look at your manuscript. Preferably an editor, but beta readers can tell you too, as long as they're going to be completely honest with you. Maybe you want to set out some questions for them to make sure that they answer whatever question you really need answered, like, is my character interesting, and in what ways? Don't just let them say yes. There are a couple of things that we can look at as writers to try to evaluate whether our character is interesting. Now again, you could totally get dinged in a review, oh, I don't think this character is interesting, I thought that character was too flat, and it is just an opinion. So just be prepared for that. There's always stuff in the comments that will conflict with other comments, and when I say comments I actually mean reviews, but you understand what I'm saying. And one of the things that you want to look at is realism. By realism, I mean, is it possible for this character to exist? Do they seem like someone you could actually meet? Is there any proof psychologically that this makes any sense? If you've got a character that's all over the map, you're probably going to have some trouble, and they're not going to seem realistic. They might seem interesting in a, oh my god, this train wreck of a character sort of way, but if they're just all over the place, then I wouldn't call it interesting. I would call that you need to edit your character, and that's okay. In all the ways I just said. An interesting character is definitely someone that people can relate to. Does that mean that they're likable? Absolutely not. I like to think that my characters are interesting in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart, especially because the entire book is character-based, so they better be interesting. I've definitely had reviews that say that there aren't really likable characters in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart, and that's okay. That is definitely something that's a bit different. That is something that I wanted to create. You can like some of the characters, you can dislike them, but it is going to change throughout the book because these characters change majorly throughout the book. That's one thing that's interesting, is your character dynamic. Do they change during the book? Do they grow? Do they devolve? Do they become worse? Some kind of growth or lack thereof, something that happens to them, some kind of conflict, mystery, uncertainty, doubt. Again, if your character is too perfect, you could end up with people being like, well, I really can't relate to this character, I don't find them interesting. So again, it really depends on what you mean by interesting. If a character isn't relatable, if they're not realistic, if their psychology doesn't add up, they just sort of don't make any sense, they're all over the place, if they don't change, it's probably not going to be that interesting. Now, of course, anybody can say, and this is completely correct, that the way the plot affects the characters is what makes the characters interesting. Sure, yeah, absolutely. If your book is a disaster book and your characters change because of the disaster, that's great. You still have interesting characters. It's when you have someone that's flat, maybe they go through the entire book and they start out as immature and they end up as immature, but somehow they've developed a romance that has grown over time, but they haven't. That's a character you might want to inspect with a very close lens and see what is going on there and how can another character love that character and the relationship grow, but another character doesn't grow. How does that make any sense? Another concern is, are secondary characters interesting? Now that's a tricky one, and that is something I definitely struggled with a little bit in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart. I had Christopher, who is the brother. He comes in later in the book, and he was a little bit tricky because I had to make sure to develop his character enough that there was some change there was some interest with his relationship with Abigail and his relationship with Emma, but he could not block out anybody else. He needed to still be somewhat in the background, at least up to a point. And so it was important that I pay very, very careful attention to the details of his character and use every word he said and every mannerism to create this character. And so if you've got a character where you're putting a lot of stuff into him or her, but nothing's really happening, that's another thing to pay attention to. That might mean they're not that interesting. So these are just some ideas. Again, interesting is very subjective. It can be very different for everyone, every reader, every writer, and those are just some tips. So I hope that this video helped you in terms of editing your characters. Tomorrow we're going to talk about plot, and thank you so much for spending time with me.